Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Obviously, this bill is necessary, really, because of Brexit, because the UK is losing the European Medicines Agency, which was actually one of the great advantages, which was working together to have a single licensing system that licensed new drugs for use right across Europe, exactly as the member for Bolton East has just been describing, working with other countries to avoid duplication and to speed up getting new drugs from the laboratory into patients who need them. The problem is manufacturers will now have to apply separately to the UK, and that means extra processes and additional costs. It's important, therefore, that whatever system is adopted, it is as similar to the EU as possible and doesn't ask for a whole different set of work-up, investigation and paperwork, or that will actually put manufacturers off launching their drugs in the UK. Obviously, the same issues apply to veterinary medicines, and hence the reason that they're in the bill. But the simple fact is the EU is a market of 500 million people, a quarter of the world pharmaceutical market. The UK on its own is only 3%. And that's why drugs tend to be launched in the US and Europe at the same time. And in all of my 33 years on the front line, I saw an acceleration of drugs getting from the benchtop to the patient because of the EU, because of the European Medicines Agency. And it means that there is likely to be delays for patients. Canada and Australia wait another 6 to 12 months before drugs are launched in those areas, in those countries. So how will the government avoid delay in patient access, particularly new drugs from outside the UK and for conditions like cancer, where patients are literally waiting for that drug? I'll happily give way.
Thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. Does she, I realise it's a distinct area, but does she share my concern that sometimes the European Union as a whole is quite slow at reform? So, for example, the Clinical Trials Directive, Clinical Trials Regulation, CTD was first devised in 2001, and we're now at 2020, and we haven't yet updated it. And actually, industry and the wider sectors would actually quite like that update to happen, but it's taken a very long time.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his point. And obviously, when trying to collaborate and get a group of 28, or indeed actually it's 31 countries because it's, the EEA are involved, to all agree to such enormous changes with legal ramifications for their own drug producers, device producers, etc., obviously it does take time. But I think that what we will see in the end is it will be worth it. Of course I would have liked it earlier. Having been involved in breast cancer trials, the Clinical Trials Directive was clunky, was bureaucratic, but it is being changed.
Would the Honourable Elizabeth White?
I will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and for answering the extremely important points that have been raised today. Would she agree with me, though, that it's extremely important that those with rare diseases still have access to the clinical trials that perhaps can only take place in the EU because they need to have so many participants, and that the UK in its own might struggle to have those clinical trials themselves for rare diseases going forward?
This is an excellent point which I will come on to shortly in my speech, but I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. Now, in the bill, it puts attractiveness as a place to do trials and supply medicines, almost on a par with safety and drug availability. So what exactly does that mean? I would agree with the Shadow Health Secretary looking for a definition of what that phrase is all about. Is it about cutting red tape? I would just point out that one man's red tape is another man's life and limb. And ABPI, the Association of British Pharmaceutical Industries, say that the industry don't want divergence or lower standards, or standards that change all the time, because actually alignment with the European Medicines Agency and the FDA in America keeps costs down, reduces delays, keeps bureaucracy down. They will have to match EU standards for the bulk of their production. They will not be keen on doing small batch production for the UK only, which has a totally different set of standards. It is also important that the new system on falsified and counterfeit measures is taken. The unique identifier number, including barcode scanning, is important, and tamper-proof containers. There is a whole market out there in counterfeit drugs, and that puts patient safety at danger. Patient safety is vital through all of this, and part of that will be how to negotiate data sharing with the EU and with the European Medicines Agency so that pharmacovigilance can happen on a bigger scale. Again, recognising a pattern of side effects, a pattern of complications from devices at a much earlier point. How will the government provide all the extra funding and support to the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, which is now going to have to take on an extensive area of extra work? How will they combine that, yet with delivering quicker assessments and licensing so as to attract companies to launch their devices or their drugs in the UK? As has already been referred to, there is a need to replace the Clinical Trials Directive, which in the original version was indeed very bureaucratic, and as a clinical trialist within breast cancer, it was often quite off-putting. But the new clinical trials regulations create an EU-wide portal, a single-point digital registration of trials, collaboration on design, recruitment, data entry and analysis. And unfortunately, UK-only regulations simply won't replace that when it finally goes live in 2022. International collaboration is critical to research, and the European Research Network is the biggest in the world. It's bigger than China, and it's bigger than the US. It is vital for rare diseases, as mentioned both by my colleague and the member for Bolton Green, where the number of patients in any one country are low. That's why we've made so much progress in rare diseases, childhood and childhood cancers in the last decade or so, because of funding from the European Medicines Agency and collaboration on an extensive Europe-wide basis. With regards to cancer, obviously my own specialty, half of all UK cancer trials are international, and 28% of Cancer Research UK trials involve at least another EU state. The Beacon trial for recurrent neuroblastoma involves 10 countries. It was designed in the UK, but the principal investigator is in Spain. Some of the original funding came from the UK, but the drug comes from Switzerland. And 10 countries are contributing to trying to find hope for children and families of this horrible disease for which we are struggling to find a cure. There were 4,800 UK-EU trials just between 2014 and 2016. How will the government maintain that sort of collaboration and involvement? Obviously, Part 3 of the bill relates to medical devices, and I would totally agree with this, not before time. Obviously, the EU has also moved to bring in regulations regarding medical devices. And I would say it's important to apply similar rules to devices as are applied to drugs. Until now, it's been far too lax. As was mentioned, manufacturers pay for assessments, and I would have to suggest the same applies to digital health apps, where companies that have designed them have assessed them themselves, rather than some neutral and independent system of ensuring that they are safe. Just because something is AI or digital does not mean it will give patients good advice. Registered clinical trials of devices should report all findings. It's far too common if there are negative findings or no advantage that they're not published, and therefore, in essence, information is being hidden. There should be no tabletop licensing of devices, as we heard, where there's simply a migration of a device from one form to another without ever being retrialed. This was exactly the problem with vaginal mesh, where in essence the end operation, in comparison to the original operation in the trials, was unrecognisable. The Cumberledge Review should obviously give us food for thought and help us focus on safety and not market expediency. It is important that there is a system to report complications to the MHRA, like the yellow card system with drugs, so that problems are spotted sooner. But again, I would say when it's across a bigger population, that is likely to be quicker. Implants should also have a unique identifier number which can be scanned as a barcode. This should be scanned to the patient's electronic records, to the hospital episode system, and also to any registers. Now, registers will just be data that is sitting there and obviously can be interrogated if you need to recall patients with certain implants because there's a problem. When there was the scandal about the PIP implants, which did not have medical-grade silicone in them, I remember having to sit and wade through one case sheet at a time of patients who'd had breast reconstruction. It was not an implant we had ever used in our hospital, but we had to be 100% certain that any patient done in the plastics unit in Glasgow also had not had these implants. So it is critical that we avoid this sort of chaos in the future. But if registers have an expert steering committee, you can actually turn a register into a registry, which is a dynamic beast that can actually monitor practice, that can actually bring knowledge back to medical practitioners, researchers, etc. And probably one of the earliest examples and biggest examples is the National Joint Registry. The bill also includes extending low-risk drug prescribing to other healthcare professionals. And I'm sure all of us recognise the change in the workforce that is already there and is coming in the future. There are already processes for assessing the competency and certifying someone, such as an advanced nurse practitioner, to prescribe in their own right. The Royal Colleges of both surgery and physicians raise the issue of physician associates and surgical care practitioners. But they feel that if prescription powers are going to be given to individuals, it is critical that they are registered and regulated. And while these new professions are developing, they are not registered or regulated. And so if this is the future of NHS workforces across the UK, it has to be dealt with. They need to be registered practitioners.
We're going to give way.
I will.
She refers to physicians and others who may not have the level of doctors. But there's also a role, I believe, for pharmacies to play when it comes to helping address head-on at the very early stages the issues, Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Deputy Speaker, of those who can be diagnosed and made aware early on. Does she feel that is something maybe should be done as well?
Well, in Scotland, we've had the community pharmacy system since 2005, which already includes that, and actually the range of protocols for a pharmacist to prescribe against has been increased. But I agree it has further potential yet. And obviously the advantage is pharmacies are open usually all day Saturday. They're often open longer hours, and for people who are working with a relatively minor condition, being able to get both advice and treatment from a pharmacist makes a big difference. Yes.
We're giving way again. And I just came to mind as I sat down there, I should have said it when I was on my feet. I believe there's a role for pharmacies to play when it comes to diagnosing sight loss or glaucoma or other things as well. Those are small things that can be done in a pharmacy. Does anybody feel perhaps maybe that's something could be addressed as well?
Well, in Scotland, we put quite a lot of effort into, if you like, sweating the assets within the community, and therefore optometrists carry out that job. They no longer refer through a GP. If they diagnose cataract, they refer directly, and actually they provide a lot of the out-of-hours care for people who have an acute eye problem, foreign body inflammation, infection, etc., to the point where there's now very few patients who go to A&E with an acute eye problem. So we have all sorts of expertise who are in our communities that we should be using, and I would agree with the honourable gentleman in that. I welcome the reference in the bill to internet pharmacy provision, but I think it is important that there is really a step up, a whole step change in stronger action for control of internet pharmacy providers, so particularly around what are termed prescription-only medicines. I had a constituent who came to me whose son was able to get large quantities of dihydrocodeine, quite addictive painkiller, over the internet, simply filling in an online form, not seeing a GP, not producing a prescription. I asked the constituent to go and find out what the website was so that I could report them. The website is gone. This is the problem of the internet, is that it is ephemeral. And unfortunately, this young man has now become addicted to dihydrocodeine and is facing trying to be weaned off that. We need to make sure that hiding in the internet, just when we talk about other versions of online harm, that we can't have people who are providing either counterfeit medicines or addictive medicines to patients without any form of control. I do have some concerns about the bill. I would agree with the Shadow Health Secretary regarding the very extensive delegated powers. Now, the Secretary of State responded that these are the same as were in place when the UK was in the EU. But these delegated powers in the past were to enact EU directives, which had been debated and consulted within the European Council, within the European Parliament. They had been worked up before agreement was reached, and therefore the delegated powers was about purely enacting something that had been hammered out and agreed within Europe. That's not the case here. Almost every clause in this bill is simply handing over a delegated power, whereas I think some of the major changes that are being brought in here are significant and should actually be primary legislation. Of course, the regulations are something that then flows from that and are under delegated powers. But to have quite radical changes purely under delegated powers, I think is a missed opportunity, and they should be limited. Part 3 talks about setting maximum sentences for offences against the bill at 6 months. I would just point out that the maximum sentence for a summary complaint in Scotland would be 12 months. And therefore, taking away that sentencing power in Scotland without any consultation does not seem right. With the presumption against sentences below 12 months in Scotland, that would make a custodial sentence almost unlikely to happen. Therefore, what kind of prevention does it have? What kind of warning is it if people are able to look and see that imprisonment is really never going to happen? The civil penalties under the Secretary of State prevent criminal prosecution if either the penalty or indeed a lower sum is paid in advance. This fetters operation of the Scottish criminal justice system because they would lose the right to prosecute if they felt that the issue was serious enough. And yet again, this and both issues should have been consulted with the Lord Advocate of Scotland and have not been. I would suggest that that is corrected as the bill goes forward. Part 4 indeed calls for consultation prior to any new regulations, but there is no formal mention of the devolved ministers, despite them carrying responsibility for healthcare. In other bills I've been involved in, it is normally that the ministers of the devolved nations are listed specifically. So why not in this legislation? It is important when it is going to impinge on such a major devolved competency that they are involved in discussions. I would also suggest that it's important that there is a structure for medical bodies, experts and industry to contribute to those consultations, to make sure that all aspects have been thought about. There is no choice for this bill to go ahead because of the legislative gap that will be left by leaving Europe, by leaving the EMA, particularly at the end of transition. And therefore, we will not be forcing a vote on it. I do hope that when it proceeds to committee, that we will be able to strengthen some aspects. But having to leave the EMA is just one example of what we're losing because of Brexit. Far from cutting red tape, Brexit will actually increase bureaucracy and costs for the pharmaceutical industry, for the NHS and for patients. And that's even before we get into the possible impact on drug costs of a US trade deal. I find it concerning to hear about the threat of walking off from negotiations in June and moving to a no-deal outcome yet again. This would increase the risk to patients, and simply calling it an Australian deal doesn't cut it. They don't have a trade deal with the EU. I would like to know whether the Prime Minister or the Secretary of State have somehow solved the problems of the supplies of insulin and medical radioisotopes, not just for a couple of months around the transition point, but in the long term. The UK doesn't produce insulin, and they don't produce medical radioisotopes. And any friction at the border, which at the moment looks inevitable, will increase the costs and delay the access of these. I also found it concerning that despite COVID-19, which initiated a COBRA meeting this morning, the UK is apparently not wanting to remain even in the pandemic early warning and response system of the EU post-transition. Such isolationist policies are dangerous for everybody, for our constituents and for our patients. You can't get away from it. Brexit is a loss to healthcare and research, and this bill can't stop that. The principle of collaboration is central to the EMA, the European Research Network, and indeed the EU itself. And it's hard to replace that if you're throwing up barriers.
Luke Evans.